I'm going to try to quickly, in a space of about 20 minutes, highlight some of the things that I think are important in the state against blacks. Some of the things that I will say will break with conventional wisdom on the subject. And matter of fact, some of the things I might say might appear to be downright sinful. And so to the extent that that might be true, you should feel free to raise any kind of question that you wish. And you need not feel as though you owe me any undue courtesy. You can get as emotional as you please or as searching as you please, at the same time keeping in mind that I have a black belt in karate. Should think about physical things. Essentially, the working hypothesis of the book is that contrary to conventional wisdom, racial discrimination alone is an inadequate explanation of black problems, of problems that black people face. Attempting, as many people see it, attempting to explain the problems that blacks face by saying that it's due to racial discrimination is somewhat like trying to explain fires. That is, if you ask me what was the cause of the Grand Hotel fire in Las Vegas a few years ago, and if I were to respond, well, it was caused by oxygen, you would be a little bit upset. And but however, while you're upset, I could say to you, well, had there not been oxygen, there would not have been a fire. But however, trying to explain the Grand Hotel fire by such a hypothesis does not explain why the Washington Hilton did not also burn down, because it too was surrounded by oxygen. So what I'm saying is that oxygen is so pervasive that you cannot explain anything with it. Now, so is discrimination of all sorts. It's so pervasive that you cannot explain anything with it. And if you don't believe me that it's so pervasive, for example, when I was choosing a wife to marry, and probably you did the same thing, I did not give every woman an equal opportunity. I systematically discriminated against white women, Chinese women, fat women, women who did not bathe regularly, and so forth and so on. We discriminate in all kinds of activities. We discriminate in all... So discrimination is pervasive. And you'll note that people even discriminate with respect to size, height. You know, there are not too many presidents in the United States that were not tall. Short people just don't make presidents. Neither do they make generals or executives. So what I'm saying is that discrimination is pervasive, and so it alone cannot explain too much. But beside that, attempting to explain outcomes on what people like and dislike is just very, very unsatisfactory. You cannot explain human behavior on the basis of what people would want to do. You cannot explain it all. That is, if I made, for example, a survey across the United States and I asked people, which do they like the most? Rolls Royces or Pintos? Most people would say they like Rolls Royces the most. Which do you like, fine jewelry or costume jewelry? Most people would say they like fine jewelry. Which do you prefer, Lafite Rothschild Bordeaux wine or Annie Green Springs wine? People would say, well, Lafite Rothschild. But however, if you watch people's behavior after having made such a survey and watch what they actually do, you see that Pintos outsell Rolls Royces, costume jewelry outsells fine jewelry, and Annie Green Springs outsells Lafite Rothschild hands down. So when you attempt to explain human behavior, you cannot only look at what they would like to do, but you have to look at what they can do. And that which determines what they can do happens to be income and prices. So we have to pay more attention to those kind of restraints. But let me get back to the notion of discrimination explaining anything. Now, if racial discrimination could explain things, well, how come the Chinese, for example, in Southeast Asia, the Chinese are discriminated against minority in Southeast Asia in most places. They are relatively tiny parts of the population, but in some countries the Chinese control up to 60% of the GNP, even though they face massive, they face massacres over the years and expulsions and things like that. Or Indians in Africa. That is, Indians face discrimination in Africa, but yet Indians tend to have the higher incomes in many African countries. Or Armenians in the post-Ottoman Empire. The Turks tried to exterminate them, but however, the standard of living for Armenians, or income for Armenians, tends to be higher than the rest of the population. And of course, it's the case of Jews. Historically, have faced discrimination, and Jews in those countries have higher income very often than the people who discriminate against them. Or if we go to America, Jews have been discriminated against in America, but they have very high incomes. Or Japanese, according to the recent census, the most recent census, the Japanese have the highest per capita income in the United States, even though they face gross discrimination, particularly in the late 1800s, and they're eventually interned. Or Poles or Jews, let's say West Indian blacks in the United States, second generation West Indian blacks, they have a higher median income than most whites. So what I'm saying is that the evidence, if you look around the world, the evidence does not support the widely held belief that racial discrimination can explain as much as people attempt to say it explains. Now, looking through the issue of race, I believe that there's a lot of confusion that I talk about in Chapter 2. There's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding because of the terminology that we use when we talk about race. That is, words shift meanings. That is, words shift in their meaning. For example, if I were to ask anybody in the Washington area, even a person like Benjamin Hooks or Vernon Jordan or Fauntleroy, and I ask them, have the water fountains at the D.C. National Airport, have they been desegregated? Now, the average American would say, yes, of course they're desegregated. What would be the test that they would use to determine whether the water fountains have been desegregated? Well, they just ask, well, if a black is at a water fountain at the airport, can he in fact take a drink? And if so, the water fountains are desegregated. But when it comes to schools, segregation has a different meaning. That is, you ask the average person, are schools in the United States segregated or not? And there'd be a lot of controversy over it. That is, many people would say yes, and many people would say no. And the test that many people would use, they'd ask, well, what percentage of the population at school consists of blacks? And if blacks were less than some preconceived notion of what the right population should be, then they would conclude that school was segregated. Now, nobody would use that same test when I asked them the question about water fountains. Nobody would say, and when I asked them, well, are the water fountains at D.C. National Airport segregated or desegregated? Nobody would say, well, black population is 70% of Washington, or 70% of the people drinking every day at the water fountains, are they black? And if not so, the water fountains are segregated. Okay, in addition to not using that kind of test, nobody, I believe, would suggest in the interest of social justice that we bus blacks from Anacostia to the D.C. water fountains and bus whites over to the water fountains in Anacostia in the name of social justice. So what I'm saying is that these words are used very sloppily, and people just don't, and they shift meanings across different subjects. I also talk about in this chapter on confusing terminology. I talk about words such as discrimination. What is discrimination? What's a good operational definition for discrimination? Well, I say, well, discrimination is solely the act of choice. That is, scarcely requires that we choose. And so we all discriminate. We must discriminate. It's a fact of life. There's another word that people use. They use prejudice. And sometimes they use the word prejudice as in a confusing fashion, and they're really talking about discrimination. Now, prejudice to me, I think that prejudice is a very, very good word if we stick with this Latin derivative. And prejudice, and it just means to prejudge. Or an economist can best understand the word prejudice or the concept prejudice to be making decisions on the basis of incomplete information, the utilization of stereotypes. Now, making decisions on the basis of incomplete information is a necessary part of life. Why? Because information is scarce, and people always seek ways to economize on information costs. So the employment of stereotypes is a useful part of people's behavior. Now, some of you might say, well, what's this guy talking about? You might say to yourself, well, look, I'm not prejudiced. Well, ask yourself the following question. Suppose after the lecture today, or the talk today, as you're leaving the room, as you turn the corner, there was a full-grown tiger standing there. What would you do? Well, I would predict, or uninteresting prediction, is that most people would endeavor to leave the area in great dispatch. That's uninteresting. Okay, but it becomes a little more interesting if you ask yourself, well, why do you run or seek safety? Is your decision to run based on any detailed information that you have about that particular tiger, or is your decision based on tiger folklore, what your friends have told you about tigers, how you've seen other tigers behave? It's probably the latter. That is, you stereotype that tiger. You say, all I need to know is that's a tiger, and I'll make my decision accordingly. And that's a prejudice type decision. You're stereotyping. Now, of course, if you were not prejudiced, what you would do is go up to the tiger and try to gather more information. Before you made a decision, you would attempt to pat him on his head to see whether he is friendly or et cetera, and only if he behaved in a menacing fashion would you then run. But most people, they say, when they see the tiger, they say that they predict that the expected cost of an additional unit of information about that tiger exceeds the expected benefit. And whenever that's true, people don't search anymore. Now, I talk about some other things in that chapter, but let's go to some use of this terminology to apply it to everyday life. Now, the fact that we recognize that people seek to economize on information costs can perhaps explain various forms of human behavior, such as redlining in certain neighborhoods. That is, banks say at the current rate of interest, or at, let's say, the mandated rate of interest, they say, well, we have to engage in credit screening. And so they may indeed use race or sex as a proxy for credit worthiness. That is, their discriminating with respect to race and sex may not have anything to do with whether they like or dislike the person involved, but they're using race, sex, and geographical location as a proxy for probability of default. But however, we misunderstand that banker's behavior if we assume that because he may not lend to blacks or he may charge some higher interest rates, we misunderstand that behavior if we assume that the behavior is motivated by his racial tastes and or sexual tastes. The same thing happens to do, the same principle can apply to hiring. That is, some schools, imagine a company that's going to hire kids graduating from high school to train them in, let's say, on-job training in physics or something like that. And they're looking for a kid who might score, who hasn't taken the test, but he might score, say, 700 on the SAT score, on the SAT test. So if he has to pay $1,000 per prospective candidate that he interviews, well then why should he go to, let's say, an all-black school where the probability of finding a successful candidate is very, very low? And so what he's doing when he does not send his recruiters to such a school, he's behaving as a Bayesian. He's looking at probabilities, and he's made some associations, and he's basing his behavior on that. So what I'm arguing here is that there are many forms of human behavior that can be accounted for by this notion, or this cleaner notion, of prejudiced behavior. That is, many forms of human behavior represent economizing on information costs, and you misunderstand that behavior if you just assume that it's taste and distaste. Okay, now, so if prejudice and all these other things that people talk about, if racial discrimination per se, dislikes and likes, things like that, if that doesn't explain the problems that blacks face, what does? Well, I'm arguing that the problems that blacks, and I might interject at this point, that the problems that blacks face are human problems. It's just the fact that they affect blacks and whites as well, but it's just that blacks bear a disproportionate burden of some of those problems. But I argue that the problems that blacks face are a result of the rules of the game. That is, we need to pay less attention to what we call racial discrimination and more attention to the rules of the game. It is because the rules of the game are very, very important in determining the outcome of the game. That is, if you can write the rules of the game, you can determine who wins the game, so to speak. Now, let me give you an example of how important the rules of the game are to who wins the game or the distribution of the winners. And I've been criticized for this example, but since I have such a rich physical endowment, I just keep on giving the example anyway. If you went around the world, you could not find 5 females that could beat the Los Angeles Lakers in playing basketball. That is probably a correct assertion. Now, the question comes up, why? Well, some of you would say, well, it's because men are taller than women, men have more upper body strength than women, men can jump higher than women, men can run faster than women, men can run backwards faster than women, so forth and so on. Well, if you gave those kind of answers, you'd be all wrong. It has to do with the rules of the game. It has to do with basketball law. And you'd see this if you say, well, Williams, we appoint you as commissioner of basketball and we give you full power to write basketball law. And we want you to rig the game so that women would win all the time. It'd be very easy. I make a new law. The game had to be played in high-heel shoes. Or you had to knit a tiny doily before you go on a fast break. Or something like that. And you can just see Jabbar with his big hands trying to get a tiny doily together. Oh, that's a simple-minded example, but the point I'm trying to make is that if I can change the rules of the game, basketball law, I can change the composition of the winners. Now, there are numerous laws in the United States that rig the game, the economic game, against certain people based on their characteristics. And one that I've done a lot of research on has to do with the minimum wage law. The minimum wage law tends to discriminate against low-skilled workers. In general, these rules that rig the game against less preferred people, less preferred based on some based on their non-pecuniary attributes, and pecuniary attributes, I might add, the common feature of these laws is that they reduce options for people to engage in voluntary exchange. That is, the common feature of all the laws that rig the game, it reduces people's abilities to engage in voluntary exchange. And the minimum wage law is one of those. And for, just briefly, because most of you understand the minimum wage law, but the effect of the minimum wage law is that it mandates that the minimum hourly pay that you can give a worker is $3.35 an hour plus some mandated fringes, Social Security and unemployment compensation, all that kind of stuff. And so it tends to discriminate against any worker who cannot produce that quantity. That is, a worker who's so unfortunate to only be able to produce $2 an hour, he faces unemployment. Now, most people who fit in that category are teenagers. Teenagers, in general, they're low-skilled. And black teenagers, they're even more low-skilled than white teenagers because they get a fraudulent education delivered to them by the government schools, and maybe there's some other socioeconomic characteristics that play a role in there. So you say, well, what's evidence of that? What kind of empirical data can we get to tend to confirm that hypothesis? We just look at unemployment statistics. Black teenage unemployment is around 50%. White teenage unemployment is 22, 24%. Now, while most Americans are aware of the high rate of unemployment among black teenagers today relative to white teenagers, they are not so aware that back in yesteryear, black teenage unemployment was less than white teenage unemployment. In 1948, at least it was either equal to or less across all age groups. And back in 1948, black teenage unemployment was, for 16-year-olds, was less than white teenage unemployment. And their labor force participation rate in every group was higher. So how do you account for that? Can you say that companies have become more racially discriminatory since 1948? I doubt whether that can explain it. Can you explain it by the economic cycle? No, because black teenage unemployment rose relative to white teenage unemployment even the best of times. You can't say that blacks were more educated than whites in 1948. the evidence, the economic evidence, suggests that increases in the level of the minimum wage law and increases in the extent of coverage of the minimum wage law accounts for a large percentage of this increase in unemployment. Now, in addition to creating unemployment for black teenagers, the minimum wage law encourages racial discrimination, or all kinds of discrimination, I should say. That is, if you must pay two workers who may be equal in their productivity the same wage, well, you might as well, what's the economic basis for choosing among workers? You have to pay them both $3.35 an hour. So you hire the workers that you like the most. And so it lowers the cost of discrimination. That is, the minimum wage law, in the case of two workers having equal productivity and you must pay them $3.35 an hour, both, it makes the cost of discrimination equal to zero. Matter of fact, the minimum wage law and equal pay for equal work laws, which have the same kind of effects as the minimum wage law, they're so effective at encouraging discrimination that South Africa, the white racist unions in South Africa, are the major supporters for the minimum wage laws and equal pay for equal work laws for blacks. I found this out while I was there. I spent 2 months in South Africa lecturing at virtually every university there, and we didn't have any. My wife and family and I, we didn't have any problems because we had diplomatic immunity, which means that we were honorary white people for 2 months. and so, but however, I did find out that the labor unions are the major supporters of minimum wage laws and for blacks, and their stated reason is to protect high-skilled white workers from low-skilled, low-wage black workers. Of course, we have more noble stated intentions behind our support for minimum wage law in the United States, but in both places, even though the intentions differ, the effects are the same. That is, it creates unemployment for the least skilled worker. Going on, another chapter of the book, I talk about occupational and business licensing. And one of the most dramatic forms of licensing is licensing of taxis. What does it take to be able to be an owner-operator of a taxi? Well, it doesn't take a college education. You need a high school. You don't even need a high school graduation, elementary school, whatever. And how much capital do you need? Capital do you need? Well, it's very little, enough for a used car, $1,000, something like that. And so I say, well, how come it's not an area for many people to get a little bit of upward mobility? Well, it turns out in New York, for example, you need to go out and buy a license that has been as high as $65,000 for each one taxi that you own. In Philadelphia, it's $20,000 down from $33,000. Boston around $40,000, and Miami around $35,000. Now, what's the effect of a law that would generate this kind of license price? Well, it tends to, a $60,000 license tends to discriminate against anybody getting into the cab business who doesn't have $65,000. These people tend to be poor. Poor people tend not to have that price. So it would discriminate against poor people getting the cab business. Now Washington, D.C., in Philadelphia, it's pretty hard to get racial data on the composition of the cab industry. In New York, for example, the Human Relations Department doesn't, they ban that kind of information. But talking to Wilson Good, who's the ex-PUC chairman in Pennsylvania, he told me that no more than 2% of the taxis in Philadelphia are owned by blacks, even though Philadelphia is a city whose black population is around 50%. But if you go to Washington, D.C., you'll see that about 70 to 80% of the taxis are owned by blacks. And why I say 70, 80%, such a large margin for error, is because my research assistant and I went to the taxi cab or the limousine commission, and we determined race of the owners of taxis by looking at the pictures on the ID cards, and some of the guys were kind of funny. We couldn't tell whether they were white or black, so we stuck with the number that we were sure of. Now, you cannot explain the ownership of taxis in Washington by saying, well, there's no racial discrimination in Washington, D.C., and there's racial discrimination everywhere else. It turns out in Washington, D.C., that you can get licenses to own and operate your taxi for fees less than the total less than $200. And $200 differs significantly from $65,000. But however, there are multiple set of beneficiaries from this relatively open market in Washington because consumers get a better deal because taxi prices are lower here. And then also, the taxi services is of a higher quality if you measure quality in number of taxis per 1,000 population. In Washington, it's 12.1 taxis per 1,000 population. New York is 2.4, and other cities around that are less. Now, there are other forms of licensing that exclude people. For example, in Miami, I was attending a conference on Liberty City riots, and I just inadvertently found out that pool cleaners are licensed in Miami. And I was asked this lady, she was on the council down there. I said, well, how come pool cleaners are licensed? Well, they said, well, it's a public health type issue because if pools aren't clean, there might be typhoid, developing plagues and stuff like this. And so I asked her, I said, are people legally allowed to clean their own pool? And so she said, yes. So I said, well, if you're concerned about public safety, people should not be allowed to clean their own pool unless they're licensed. And so I said, well, who's supporting this kind of stuff anyway? She said, well, it's the Pool Cleaners Association. and it turns out that in order to get a license to clean a pool, you have to go to pool cleaning school in Miami for, I believe, a year or so and learn chemistry, diatomaceous soil, and all that kind of stuff. And they're roughly, I could go on and on, but there are roughly 3,000 different licensing jurisdictions in the United States that license things from landscapers, pig feeders, auctioneer, junk people, et cetera, et cetera. And the effect of the licensing is to raise the cost of entry, and the incumbents wish to do this. If they raise the cost of entry, they can restrict entry and charge higher prices to us all. Included in this regulation is the ICC and the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is the lobby for the truckers and the Teamsters. They restrict entry. They act on behalf of big trucking companies and the Teamsters, and they make it very, very difficult for people to enter the market, the PUC on the state level. But let me just point out one of the problems in regulation, in the ICC regulation, that suggests that we don't approach these problems correctly. For example, I came across a black trucker in my research on ICC regulation, a black trucker named Ward Smith. He was in Omaha, Nebraska. He bid the lowest bid to ship the household effects of Air Force personnel at Offutt Air Force Base. He was not awarded the contract because he did not have broad enough ICC authority to ship goods across state lines. Ultimately, the contract was awarded to another trucker who bid $80,000 higher than Ward Smith. Well, so in the first approximation, you and I lost as taxpayers, and Ward Smith lost. Now, many people, seeing that blacks don't have many government contracts, they argue and they propose affirmative action, or actually more correctly stated, quota programs for blacks. Now, Ward Smith did not need a quota program. He needed government off his back because he did not need any help at all. But the quota programs don't deal with the government-erected collusion for the Teamsters and the trucking industry. Furthermore, there are many white truckers who can't get broad ICC authority either. And so what does it do for racial relations for a white trucker who only differs from Ward Smith by color to see Ward Smith get a contract and they not get one? That is, it gets two people fighting one another when the true villain of the piece is the United States government. Now I'm going to wind up in a minute because I'm sure you have some questions, but one of the things I want to make sure, very, very clear, is that these regulations or these restrictions on markets aren't necessarily racial. That is, while I was doing some of the research on taxis, I used to, whenever I got in a taxi, I would strike up a conversation with the driver, try to get some gossip type information. And so anyway, I landed at D.C. National Airport one time, and the black driver picked me up, cab driver picked me up, and I said to him, gee, you guys in Washington are very lucky because Almost anybody can get in. You don't have to go out and buy a $65,000 medallion in order to own and operate a taxi. So the driver said to me, he said, well, we've been trying to get a medallion here, but the Congress won't go along with it. He says, as it is, with these these cheap license prices, we got these damn West Indians coming in, the Pakistanis, the Arabs, and everything like this. So the point for you to keep in mind is that it's not necessarily a racial thing. It's the ins versus the outs, and the outs want to keep the outs out so that they can charge higher prices. Let me just spend 2 minutes talking about one other thing, because if you don't buy the book, I encourage you to buy the book and give it to all your friends. But if I don't tell you this, you'll never know. Income differences. A lot of people argue that income differences suggest racial discrimination. Well, it's not very clear that it does. You know, you heard the frequently made statement that since 1960, black median income is 58% of whites. And then people go on to say that, well, as proof of racial discrimination, that we haven't done anything to solve the problems of race in the United States, even when blacks graduate from college. Black males, when they graduate from college, only make 74% of what white males make who are college graduates. Well, I came across that figure, and so I said, well, before I do a little study, do some statistics on it, let me see about black and white females. And when I started going over the data for black and white females, I discovered the best-kept secret of all times. It even exceeds the secrecy that surrounded the Manhattan Project in World War II. And that is, black female college graduates, their income, their median income, is 125% of white females. And I looked at it and I said, could it be that white men and black women have some kind of conspiracy going against black men and white women? So, not being taught to subscribe to conspiracy doctrines, I did some rank order correlation test. It's kind of a statistical test where you compare distributions. And to make a long story short, I found out that there are over 26 different occupational categories for professionals and college graduates. Black and white females are virtually identically distributed across the occupations. That is, the most important category for women, both black and white females, black and white women, is non-university teachers. That is, 44% of college graduates, female college graduates, are non-university teachers, and roughly the same across race. The second important category was nurses, and black and white females are roughly the same proportion of nurses. Now, switching over to males, black and white males, the most important occupational category for black males was non-university teachers. I believe it's something like 29%. And I believe white men were something like 16%. But the most important, largest category for white men was engineers. Something like 21% of white male professionals were engineers, and something like 5% of black male professionals were engineers. Which suggests, if you look at the median income differences between non-university teachers and engineers, the year I took did the test, engineers were making $14,000, and non-university teachers are making slightly less than $8,000. So looking at the distribution, even if everybody were paid the same wage for every job, black and white males would earn different income or lower median income than white males. But you might say, well, I didn't explain why black females earn more than white females. Now, before you rush out to say that as a result of affirmative action, keep in mind that in 1960, black females who were college graduates, they earned 102% of white females. And in 1950, they earned 99%. So you can't attribute it to affirmative action. What I believe it is the fact that blacks are more urbanized than are whites, and it turns out that teachers who work in urban centers receive much higher pay than teachers in rural centers or suburban areas, and nurses who work in urban centers earn more than nurses who work in rural centers. Back in Philadelphia, at school I used to teach at from Temple University, they used to pay nurses hazardous duty pay to work in Philadelphia. Okay, so what's the policy recommendation for all this? Well, I suggest that a courageous president, as I wanted President Reagan to be, and as he turned out to be less than that, I believe, he would have the Justice Department of the United States bring antitrust suits against these localities that have state-erected monopolies. But however, there's a problem with the Parker Doctrine. The Supreme Court said in the Parker case in the early 40s that states are immune from antitrust laws. So we'd have to do something about the Parker Doctrine. There's also tools at the hand of the FTC for prosecution against anti-monopoly or antitrust, to take antitrust cases. I believe, more importantly than that kind of solution, I believe that we need to view the problems of blacks as human problems, because a $65,000 license discriminates against a person of any color getting in the cab business. So it's a human problem. It's just that blacks came to cities late, after the licenses were, laws were enacted. That's why there's this differential impact on them. But I believe that if we view these problems as human problems, a better or more viable political coalition can be formed. And then finally, in a kind of summary sense, I propose lawlessness as a policy recommendation. That is, in New York, there are 11,787 legal cabs operating along the street, but they have a gypsy industry there. And the estimates on the gypsy industry is that there are 5,000 to 14,000 taxis operating as gypsies. So what a lot of people have said in New York is that we're going to go out and earn an honest, albeit illegal, living. And I advocate that more people do that kind of stuff. And I advocate that people illegally operate buses and illegally operate trucks across the highway, earn an honest but an illegal living, which is quite consistent with our founding fathers, because a lot of our founding fathers were smugglers and gun runners and people like that who wanted to earn an honest living. Well, look, that's all I have time to say. There's many more things I could say, but you feel free to raise any kind of question or make any kind of comment that you wish in the question and answer box. Thanks.